Okay. All right. Well, it's 7 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get things started here. My name is Sam Jack. I'm a librarian at Newton Public Library in Newton, Kansas, and I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Gretchen Eick, who's the author of They Met at Wounded Knee. Before I turn things over to her, I just want to put in a few quick plugs for what's coming up at the library, and then a couple of housekeeping type announcements. Those of you with teens or young people in your life, you might like to know that tomorrow afternoon at 3, our teen librarian Sharon is having Teen Afternoon of Crafts. I've seen she's got the table all set up back there, and it's covered in craft supplies, and it's a lot of fun for anybody ages 10 to 18. Is invited to come and do some Christmas/holiday crafting. Then on Tuesday, November 23rd, back here on Zoom, we have author Roxy Yonke, who is going to give a talk about her new book, 100 Things to Do in Kansas Before You Die. So you can plan that next road trip before it's too late. And then we are closed for Thanksgiving and the Friday after that. And then one more thing coming up in December, I want to mention, because it's also like this program, it's Native American history related. We have on Tuesday, December 21st at 7 p.m., we have Denise Lowe and Ramon Powers. They're the authors of a new book called Northern Cheyenne Ledger Art by Fort Robinson Breakout Survivors. And that's a book that presents artwork created by Native Americans who were in prison waiting for their execution in the Dodge City Jail in 1879. So I guess that's about all I know about it now, but it'll be really fascinating to learn more. And then before I turn it over to Gretchen, I'll just say, I think that we're going to have Gretchen speak, and then we'll have time for Q&A and a more interactive portion where we can talk back and forth and have questions and stuff. Those of you on Zoom, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a button that says Q&A, and it's got some speech bubbles, and you can type questions in there. You can also use the chat, both will work. And then those of you on Facebook, I've got the Facebook monitor here on my phone. So you can also type questions or comments in the Facebook chat, and then I will see those and add them to the conversation that we're having here on Zoom. So without further ado, Gretchen, I'll let you introduce yourself as you see fit. And then I'm so excited to hear what you have to share with us today. You're on mute, Gretchen. Sorry, that's
I'm going to share my screen, and I'll talk over what's on the screen, so you will have a chance to learn some things that I've learned in about 12 years of research on this particular book. I started work on the Eastmans a long time ago. I was looking for a second topic after I finished my first academic book, Descent in Wichita. And I'd read about Charles Eastman and found him a really fascinating man. I was teaching at Friends University. I had a daughter who was at Smith College in Western Massachusetts. And so I came out to Western Massachusetts to visit her, and discovered that in the archives of Smith were the papers of Charles Ohiyesa Eastman's wife, Elaine Goodale Eastman, and began thinking, well, I can come out and visit. I could spend a lot of time in the archives and still see my daughter and have, be able to do kind of double duty. So that's what I did at a couple of years, and got to visit the places that were part of the Eastmans' lives. This book came out in 2020, in October of 2020, and it's the product of a lot of determination to just not let it die, because it was going to come out in 2008. I was sending it around to publishers, and my husband developed a kind of cancer and needed a knee replacement, and our youngest daughter was getting married here in Wichita, and my computer crashed with 6 years of research files in it. So I thought, okay, set it aside, and this is not meant to be. So I picked it up again in 2015, and by that time we were I just kept working at it. Fortunately, I had a hard copy of the manuscript with all my footnotes, and I was able to then pick up from that. I retired from teaching full-time at Friends University in 2013 and began seriously writing, not just this book, but 4 novels and a number of other things as well, historical novels and a number of other things as well. And this one won the Coffin Memorial Book Award this last month here in Kansas. And I was very fortunate to be named the Prose Writer of the Year, which was really thrilling to me. So I want to take you on a journey tonight. The journey is into the lives of 2 people. One, a Native American doctor who becomes a physician, a doctor, and the other, a young European American teacher who has the stamina and the guts to in the 1880s to go out to the Great Plains when this was very unusual for women, and to teach Sioux children, and then to become the director of Sioux education out on the Great Plains, especially in South Dakota. And she learns the language. He learns the language. I mean, obviously, it's his native tongue, and they meet, and that is where that's kind of the story is about. It begins with that, and then pursues the rest of their lives together. So I would like to start by taking a look at this map. This is a map of Minnesota, and you see a lot of dates, and you see almost nothing that doesn't have a date. This is all native land, indigenous land, most of it Dakota. Some of it would be Chippewa or Ojibwe, but mostly Dakota land taken. Dakota are the Eastern Sioux or the Santee Sioux. And these are treaties that took land away from them and gave it to the federal government in exchange for what are called annuities, which would be both products like sacks of flour and cloth, and also cash payments. This was part of the treaty system that really began with Thomas Jefferson. So I wanted you to notice this because you see that this is a huge part of the state of Minnesota. And the last little piece of Lakota land is this little strip along the Minnesota River. It's 10 miles wide, and they've been removed. And in 1862, as the United States Civil War was underway, at about the time that Tennessee had been taken by the Union forces and New Orleans, the Dakota found themselves starving. Their people were starving. Annuities had not arrived. They were pushed onto this tiny bit of land, and it really wasn't enough to sustain life. And some young teenagers were getting so frustrated because they kept going to the headquarters on the reservation where they were supposed to get food and not receiving it. It would not have arrived, or it would have arrived and it was in a warehouse and the money hadn't arrived yet. So the reservation officials were not willing to make a distribution of the food. They wanted to do it all at one time. And the people would say, we're starving. Our families are starving. Please give us the food. This was a really, really desperate time for them. And some teenagers took things into their own hands and stole some chicken eggs. And when the European American farmers came out, hearing them in the chicken coop, the young men shot and killed them. And that was the beginning of what is called the Dakota War against the United States. It's the only war declared by an indigenous peoples against the United States of America. Families were divided. Families, including the family of the man who would become Charles Eastman, were divided about this war. The elders did not think it made sense to go to war. They said, we will just lose more. Look at what we've already lost. The situation will just get worse. But the young warriors persuaded Little Crow that war was their best chance at restoring their land and surviving. And we know that they were wrong. The United States Army, as they put down this war, remember this is the middle of the Civil War, and it's a low point in the Civil War for the Union Army, for President Lincoln. They moved the families who were, let me go back to that for a minute. They moved the families of those who were captured or who had come in to surrender, including the large majority of whom had not supported the war and had actually protected white captives and had brought them into their homes. There was a lot of intermarriage on the Great Plains. There was a lot of intermarriage in these Indian encampments, not so much on either coast, but definitely in the encampments. So the Army removed the people, sent some of them to a prison, sent some of them to another reservation, to a reservation farther out and far more remote, and brought a bunch of them to Fort Snelling, which is about today. If you fly in and out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Fort Snelling is right there, and right by the Minneapolis River. And between the river and the fort was a stockade, and this is a photograph of it with the teepees of those who lived there from the fall through the spring of 1862, 1863. It was a horrible time, just a desperate time, and people were so angry. Many of the settler community were so angry with the Dakota for going to war that that they harassed them, and I mean, there was just a lot of violence. The young man, Charles Eastman, was 4 years old when this was happening. It was his great-grandfather who had been one of the elders of the Dakota community and had been responsible for opposing the war, but his great-grandfather died within this settlement, within this stockade in the winter of 1862-63, in the cold and the harsh conditions, with nothing but canvas tents. Charles Ohiyesa, those in that point in his life, he's called Ohiyesa. Ohiyesa flees to Canada with his grandmother. They are fleeing the dragnet of the US Army that's trying to round up all of the Dakota and force them out of the state of Minnesota. So they're walking. He tells about this in his first biography, Indian Boyhood, and it's a stunning story. She would carry him on her back, and they would go through by a river. They would try to find things to eat. They would eat birds. They would eat whatever they could find to stay alive. And in December, they arrive in Canada, and Canada takes them in, takes these Dakota refugees in, and lets them stay. But being a refugee is not a very pleasant life, and to say the least. So it's a rough time. The young boy grows up there from age 4 or almost age 5 to age 15. He's living as a refugee in Canada, and he's taught by his uncle and his grandmother that his father and brothers have been among those who were executed for this war against the United States that was lost by the Dakota. When they lose the war, there is this mass retaliation. There are more than 300 people that are going to be executed, 300 Dakota that will be executed, because there have been kind of kangaroo courts that have been bringing up everybody who comes into the places where they're supposed to come and surrender, and they take testimony, and the procedure is done very, very quickly. Some people are executed because they didn't speak, they didn't understand what was being said to them. So there were some who were elderly and who were infirm and who were mentally ill. But Lincoln says he will not abide by executing 300 and some people. He says this is not acceptable. And so he sends out his secretary to look at each case and to make a decision as to which ones should be executed. There still are some mistakes made, but I'm going to see if I can pull this over so you can see. There are 38 people executed. One is given, there's supposed to be 39, and one is given a reprieve at the last minute. They're executed in Mankato on the day after Christmas, 1862, and huge crowds come to watch. This is a drawing from, I think it's Harper's, of the execution itself. It's the largest execution in our history. the boy, Ohiyesa, I'm sorry, I've got to move this back and go back a slide. At the age of 15, Ohiyesa comes home from hunting one day and he sees this man dressed in European American Western clothing with a short haircut, looking very European American, except his skin is darker. And he's immediately on guard because he's been trained to avenge the execution of his father, believing his father and his brothers were among those executed in Mankato. And he discovers, to his chagrin, that this man who's standing in front of him is actually his father. And I say to his chagrin because he's been trained to really distrust and to avenge the mistreatment of his people by white people, by European Americans. But his father says, you know, I decided, your brothers and I were in prison. We were not, obviously we're not executed, but we decided when we got out of prison that the best thing to do, the smartest thing to do, was to actually become homesteaders. And so we filed homestead claims. Homesteading was supposed to be for European Americans predominantly, but occasionally an African American or a Native American would file a claim and would get a homestead. And that's what happened to Charles' father. He also changed his name. He took on the name of his wife's grandfather, Seth Eastman. If you go to the United States Capitol today, you will see in one of the stairwells a huge painting done by Seth Eastman. Eastman had come west as a young soldier and then later became a very well-known artist. He had a child with a Lakota woman, a Dakota woman, and that child's child was Charles Eastman's mother. His father tells him, you know, we have to go with the flow. Basically, we have to adjust to the times, and it's clear that violence is not going to be appropriate. It's not going to get us anywhere. What it's gotten us now is we've been expelled from the state of Minnesota. We've lost all of our annuities. We have nothing. So you need to become a warrior who uses books for your weapons. You must come back to the United States with me, where I'm homesteading in Flandreau, South Dakota, and we'll get you an education and we'll teach you to abide in this world as a person who can walk with a foot in both camps. So in part, Charles is forced by his father to assimilate. He comes home, he's sent to school. He doesn't live on a reservation. He doesn't experience reservation life, although that's what most Native peoples would have been experiencing at this time. He instead goes to college and goes east. And this is at the same time that the Battle of Little Bighorn takes place, in which Custer and his regiment are killed. And so there's a lot of animosity in the country, sort of free-floating animosity, especially toward people who are Sioux. And the Sioux include Nakota, Lakota, and Dakota people. They're just different branches of the Sioux. He finishes Boston Medical School. He's been a celebrity in the East Coast. He's met prominent people, writers, well-known celebrities, and he himself has become kind of a celebrity. He's a football star, he's very bright, and he passes the medical exam. Very few American doctors had passed a medical exam at this time. And in 1890, in the fall of 1890, in November, he goes to Pine Ridge Agency in South Dakota. The agency is the headquarters of the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he is to be their first Native American government physician. There is, at the same time, a young woman who comes to Pine Ridge. Her name is Elaine Goodale. She had been a poet, recognized at the age of 14. A book published with her poetry was acclaimed by people like Longfellow, who said she's going to be the next great American poet. She actually supported her family with money that she made as a teenager from her poems. And I know that those of you who are poets today find that pretty awesome, because very few poets make any money from their poetry today. Elaine had also she'd hoped to go to college, but she wasn't able to do that because the family didn't have the money. So she took a job at Hampton she got through an old friend of the family, teaching Indians, an assortment of people from many different nations in Hampton, Virginia, at Hampton Institute, in a kind of pilot program for Native peoples, not all men. And from that, she got to go visit a new experiment that was happening in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was a school that was an industrial school. It was called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, run by General Richard Pratt, who was thinking this was maybe the best that could be done for Native people when the Civil War ended and the mission of the United States military turned to pacification of the Great Plains. So she's also a photographer, and we have a bunch of her photos that tell us about her life. This is one of her photographs of where she stayed on the Great Plains. She had a buggy, she had a camera, and she lived with Lakota people as she taught. And we'll see at the end a picture of one of the schoolhouses she taught in. She comes to Pine Ridge in the fall of 1890 and meets this handsome celebrity doctor who is now going by the name of Charles Eastman, Charles Alexander Eastman. He's dropped his Sioux name of Ohiyesa. This is another of Elaine's pictures. This is at the same time that they both arrive at Pine Ridge, and you see what the settlement looks like. Hardly a tree. You can't really see a tree. You see a lot of teepees, and it's very cold. She takes a number of pictures, including this one. This one is a photograph of the gathering of the people to receive their annuities. Remember, that's what set off the Dakota War back in 1862 when Charles was only 4 years old. When they went to get their annuities, they came from all over the reservation and they were not given anything. So she took a picture of these gatherings, sometimes monthly, sometimes less frequently. And she also knew from her experience living with the Lakota and Nakota people that there was a lot of graft and corruption going on, that there was a lot of money to be had if you could get the contracts to supply the annuities, the sacks of flour, the cloth, cows, some building supplies, etc. And you gave your cronies, if you were in Congress or if you were in the Indian Bureau or you were an Indian agent, often you could arrange for your friends, your cronies, to get those contracts. And she wrote actively criticizing what was going on and the corruption and graft involved on the reservations. In November, that November after they arrive at the reservation, they both arrive at the reservation. The person in charge of the reservation, the agent, decides that there is a very dangerous thing happening on the reservation. He hears the chants and the drums of people who are dancing down by the creek, Little Bighorn. And he is convinced that this must mean the Sioux are going on the warpath. Charles and Elaine, who speak the language and who have interviewed many people, go to him and say, this is not war. This is a religious revival movement that's happening all across the Great Plains. Many different nations are believing that if only they can be penitent enough, that God will restore their lands to them. So please, let's dance in our own tradition. We dance until we are totally exhausted, and then we make room. We are able to lift ourselves above the material world and make room for God's vision to come into our lives. And that's what they're doing. They believe it was a kind of mixture of traditional religion and Christianity, because they believed that this was going to happen and God was going to really reward them for their penitence. The Indian agent would not pay any attention. He called in the United States Army, and this is an interesting point of the history. The group that came to Pine Ridge, the Army units that came to Pine Ridge, were General Custer's former regiment, which, as you can imagine, those folks are not very keen to take any kind of an empathetic view of Native Americans, because all of their regiment had been killed except one person in 1876. The other group that came was a Black regiment. The Army was segregated, and so there was a Black regiment and white regiment up on the rise around the agency, the center of the reservation at Pine Ridge. And they had their guns. They had big Gatling guns. They were all aimed down to where the Indians were dancing, and the dancing was going on quite constantly, with new people coming in from out the outskirts of the reservation to join them. They decide, they are told by the Indian agent that they must give up their guns. This is December, just at Christmas, the hardest of all hard times in South Dakota to survive outside if you can't hunt. But they line up and they give up their guns. And as they're going through the line and their guns are being taken from them, a mentally challenged boy resists having his gun taken, and a shot is heard, and immediately the Army pours in bullets into the dancers. And the Army gets on their horse, the men get on their horses and start riding down into the river, shooting as they go and chasing people way out miles from the Wounded Knee Creek. The next day a blizzard hits and nobody can go anywhere. But after the blizzard clears a couple days later, Dr. Eastman calls for volunteers to go with him to try to find the survivors, if there are any survivors. You can see the bodies rigid, frozen in this wagon. You can see some of the people who went out as volunteers. There is a graphic picture of the mass graves where people were buried. Among the people who went to volunteer, there were, as far as I know, no people who were not Native in origin. This is a picture that was a photograph that was taken as they rode out miles from Wounded Knee Creek and what they saw. And you see that the burnt remains of teepees and the remains of people. There were all men, women, and children, elderly people, etc. Probably at least 250, 300 possible, those are conservative figures, were killed at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. This is Charles at this point, and this is Elaine. They wrote letters to the President of the United States. They wrote letters to the Secretary of the Interior. They wrote letters everywhere that they could. They wrote articles about what had happened that were published in magazines and journals. Interestingly enough, there's quite a lot of evidence that people in the military believed this was a massacre of peacefully assembled Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne. But there were medals of honor given to the soldiers who participated. Drawn together by the trauma and by their mutual commitment to Native people, they fall in love and get married 6 months after the massacre at Wounded Knee. This is a picture of Elaine that was on the cover of one of her autobiography, which was published posthumously. You can kind of see she's a pretty intense, committed young woman, and she's very feisty. She's willing to speak up and speak out against what's going on in terms of Indian policy or other policies. And she's pretty well known. If you were making money from your poetry at age 14 and had books published and were told you were going to be the next Longfellow, you probably would feel pretty good about yourself as a woman of that time. She's better known than Charles, even though Charles has his own celebrity at this time. That will be reversed as their lives play out together. She'd criticized people. She'd gone to the Friends of the Indian annual meetings and given speeches and criticized politically appointed agents. She'd criticized the way they acted, or the way they talked about Native people, etc. She named the racism for what it was. Charles and Elaine become monitors of corruption on the reservation. And they start recording how the annuities are going missing. They become, in short, whistleblowers. They complain to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who happens to be known to them both personally. Elaine had been hired by him to supervise Sioux education. He orders an investigation, and the investigation determines that about $10,000 had been dishonestly withheld from the Sioux just on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1891. That would be about 283, almost more than $250,000 in the dollars of 2020. The agent who is in charge of the reservation, they replace the former agent with a new agent. These are political appointments. And this agent charges Charles Eastman with insubordination because they're gathering information about the theft that's going on, theft of annuities. They're complaining to people in high places, and this is insubordination. Charles even made a trip to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Secretary of the Interior and President Benjamin Harrison. Teddy Roosevelt wrote to a friend of his who was an Indian reformer that he thinks that peaceable men and women and children were killed under circumstances that should have called for the most rigid investigation. But when Teddy Roosevelt later comes to Pine Ridge 2 years later to make his own investigation, he won't meet with the Eastmans either. Congress had appropriated $100,000 for those who had lost property and lives at Wounded Knee. It went to white ranchers, although the people that were killed were almost entirely Lakota, Dakota, Sioux. Eastman found that 10 to 15% of that money that was for kind of a reparation, I guess, was being taken by the staff, was being pocketed. Teddy Roosevelt dismissed the claims, and Eastman was forced to leave his job, to leave work as the reservation physician. He moved his family to Minnesota and set up his medical practice. The only problem was, even though he was one of the highly qualified physicians, having passed his exams and gone to medical school, few European Americans would go to him for medical care. And I think that's probably not surprising if we think about I'm not sure how far we've come even today on that. He's living in Minnesota, and just to give you a sense of just a little piece of data I found that I thought was fascinating. In the Minnesota Historical Society, there was a jar with the scalp and bones of Little Crow, the leader of his people's, Charles People's war against the United States, the Dakota War of 1862, publicly on display in the museum. Which, think about it for a minute, put that in your own context of people in your community who might have been to you a hero, whose bones might be displayed at a museum, if that would be something that would be disturbing. I don't know why I have this extra here, but let's see if we can get rid of it. Whoa, no. Okay. Charles, I will have to leave that up, I'm afraid. Charles took a job for the YMCA when he could not make a living as a doctor. They hired him to go all around the country to different reservations and to set up branches of the YMCA. He was a Christian. He took his religion pretty seriously, and he traveled across the country, and he would meet with young people to draw them into the YMCA, but he would also meet with the elders. And it was a very nurturing time for him because he was learning a lot about his culture and Native peoples in general, because he'd spent his time in Canada in a refugee camp. He'd never lived on a reservation. This photograph is of their first child, Dora Winona, who was born when they were at Pine Ridge, and then they left in 1892 and had a second child, Irene Saluda, who will come up later in this presentation. Eventually, they had 6 children in very close succession. So Elaine is faced with the hardship of having to relocate, not being able to he's not making much money, and having 6 children to raise and very little time for her writing. In 1871, Congress decided that Indian treaties were no longer going to be valid. They were canceled. And in fact, in canceling the treaties, Native American status as independent nations changed to being wards of the United States government. Wards are like a child, right? A child, a minor child is a ward. If they lose their parents, they become wards. So Native Americans became wards. And the treaties, which said changes to the treaties would have to be agreed upon by, in the case of the Sioux, 3/4 of the people. This was going to be abandoned. Attention was not going to be paid from here on. And in fact, the change in policy was huge at about the same time as Wounded Knee. A law was passed called the Dawes Act, and you may have heard of the Dawes rolls, which called for Native people to come in and enroll, put their names on the Dawes rolls. They still exist. They are still used. And if you put your name on the Dawes roll for your nation, you would be signing an agreement to accept 160 acres of reservation land for your household, and with the expectation that citizenship would be given to you quite soon. But you would have to agree to give up any communal or collective claim to that land. Now, 160 acres may sound like a lot, especially if you're not living on the Great Plains, but that land is mostly suitable for ranching if it's not irrigated. It's not suitable. West of Wichita, it's very west of where we are now, from where I'm speaking to you, the land is very hard to farm without irrigation. So the 160 acres wasn't much and was very difficult to make a living on. Remember that 60% of homesteaders turned tail and went elsewhere, gave up their homesteads because they just couldn't make it. But the policy was, let's make Indians farmers. Eastman got another job on another reservation, Crow Creek. He did the same thing there, and his wife as well, that he had done at Pine Ridge in terms of speaking the language, going to people's homes, going to his patients, to his what you'd call them anyway, the people on the reservation. He would go to their homes, he'd talk with them in their language. He would find out what was going on, and he would report what was going on. And this did not endear him to the person in charge of the reservation, the agent at this reservation, just like it hadn't at Pine Ridge with the two agents he'd worked under there. In this time, the agent doesn't just charge him with insubordination, he charges him with adultery. Investigators come out. There are 2 investigations made. The first one says Eastman has done absolutely nothing wrong. There's nothing to support these charges. The second one, and what happens to him over and over is this pattern of there'll be an investigation, and when the investigation finds him innocent, then they'll send out a second investigator, almost to see if we can get a different result. So the second investigator also finds that they can't find evidence, but they recommend that he should be moved because he's a source of troublemaking, and that the woman he's accused of having a relationship with should lose her job teaching at a school, Indian school, and should be removed as well. The good thing to come out of this difficult time at Crow Creek Reservation was writing. Elaine said to Charles, "You have incredible stories of growing up. You have incredible stories from your travels around the country, setting up YMCAs. Write up your stories. We can send them to magazines, kids magazines, the most popular kids magazine of the day. We'll send them to other magazines that are popular with adults. And maybe you can even put them together into a book." And that's what he does. He begins to write. She types his work, his manuscripts, and she takes on the role of sending them out, of doing the marketing work. And he begins to have a reputation as a writer. He has worked for 6 years as a reservation doctor on 2 reservations. He worked for 4 years traveling all across the reservations for the YMCA. And then he is hired to give the Sioux, 25,000 Sioux, surnames so that they can inherit their allotments. And remember that allotment of 160 acres has become national policy. The United States was going to get as many Native people as possible to take 160 acres of land as an allotment and give up their collective claim to the additional land on reservations, which would then open that land for white settlement and for mining and ranching and other activity that would not be done by Native people, because it'd be a lot of land left over. Charles gets this job because he speaks Lakota and everybody recognizes he's really talented. And his friend Harlan Garland helps him to get this job, and he works for 7 years. It's a very productive time in his life. Going to the reservations, the Sioux people did not use a surname, a common surname for a family. You might have several different names for different things, for your position in the family, for when you were born, for your parents, but there was no surname that would mark all of us as being part of the same family. So his job was to interview each person, each family, identify who were family members, and assign them a surname. 25,000 people he assigned surnames. Meanwhile, Elaine is trying to make it in Minnesota, and it's just impossible. They're not making any more money than they made when he was the first time a reservation doctor at Pine Ridge. There's been no increase despite inflation. Money is really tight. And her father says, why don't you come back to Massachusetts? You can live in my cottage, Lodestone. And you can raise your family there while Charles is doing his traveling and assigning names. So he moves his family back. And this is the cottage. It still stands in Amherst, Massachusetts. But when he does that, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the longest serving commissioner, Walter Jones, and a very corrupt commissioner, it turns out. Many years later, it was discovered he was taking a huge cut from the annuities. He thinks, Eastman has this reputation for asserting himself. And he sees Charles moving his family as insubordination. So he's happy for the work Charles has done, but he's not willing to continue his employment there. So he does 7 years doing this naming project, and then he is once again without a job. He has a brother who is a Presbyterian pastor, and the two of them began to lobby Congress to give back the annuities that Congress had stopped, all of the annuities to the Dakota people, the Eastern Sioux. Indians are not allowed to argue before the US courts. They had to have a congressman make their case. But they're there and they're lobbying. They're going door to door and talking to members of Congress. They're talking to presidents of the United States. They're trying to get this injustice of their losing all of their annuities for the millions and millions of acres of land they lost. They're trying to get this injustice recognized and the money restored. But they're not making any money themselves, and the lives of Elaine and the family, who are now, once again facing desperate poverty, are really getting worse and worse with all these children that she's also raising. And Elaine goes to Richard Pratt, General Richard Pratt, the man who founded Indian industrial boarding schools, and asks him to give them jobs at Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Charles would recruit students, and she would do all the writing and editing of their publications. By the way, it took 20 years of lobbying before the Dakota Congress did restore some of their funds in 1921. 20 years of lobbying. Okay, so they leave Washington, D.C. They are in pretty bad shape financially. Every time they move, they end up selling their furniture and doing whatever they can just to get enough money to make the move. He hates working at Carlisle Indian School. He doesn't believe in boarding schools. He thinks they destroy the culture because they forbid anybody speaking the language. They forbid wearing traditional dress, and they prepare students for jobs which are really pretty obsolete on reservations. But during this time, he's still writing. While he's working on the naming project, he wrote 4 books, and he wrote articles that were published in the major journals of the United States, including, and some minor ones that were known for Native American publications. The Nation magazine still exists today. Vogue still exists today. The New York Times still exists today. And all of those published his work. So he's getting a reputation as a writer, and his celebrity is increasing. But it's increasing at the very time that the plight of Native peoples was worsening. A lot of folks believed Native peoples were going to be vanished. They were called vanishing Americans. They were going to die out, basically. And Charles feels called during this time to make the case for the values of Native cultures, religions, practices. And these are some of the 11 books that he wrote. And you'll notice that these are all written within a 14-year period. The one that I'll show you at the end, if you're going to read one, I would say read From the Deep Hills to Civilization. But actually, most of what he writes is really quite fascinating. He's doing this writing at the time that Congress once again changes Indian policy. And this is a kind of given that Congress is going to act, and Congress now has many Western states that have been admitted to the Union. And those Western states get home rule. They get the power to control their own states. And of course, what happens to Native people in their states is not high priority. In fact, it may be antithetical to the interests of the settler community. This isn't too surprising because it's happening all around the world at this time, colonizing with settler communities. And today we talk about Indian policy being the colonization of Native Americans in the middle of the country, in the whole of the country, basically. A new law is passed in 1906, and I'd like you to try to focus on, I know this is a lot of material, but I think this is a really significant sign of what's happening in terms of Native attitudes toward Native people. It said that citizenship would be granted after 25 years, after someone had accepted an allotment, 25 years after they accept the allotment, or even more than 25 years after they accept an allotment. In other words, instead of accepting 160 acres, giving up your collective claim to land and getting citizenship, it would be at least 25 years before you would get citizenship. At least 25 years. And this would be up to the Secretary of the Interior. The Burke Acts gave that Secretary of the Interior personal authority to determine, and the laws actually use these terms, the law uses these terms, which Indians were competent to manage their own affairs and which were non-competent. The Secretary of Interior could decide how long non-competent Native Americans would remain in trust status and not receive citizenship. And during this time, if it was determined you were non-competent to handle your affairs, reservation after reservation, the agents reported about this, you had to petition to get your annuity. This is your own money. This is the money that you were being paid for the land your people relinquished to the US government. But you had to request and petition for even the most basic necessities, like, for example, diapers. You had to make a special request, a petition, to be given the money to buy diapers. Unable to sustain farming on these allotments, many Native peoples were leasing their land to white ranchers. And this is kind of a desperate time. By 1918, agents wrote to the Bureau of Indian Affairs that people on their reservations were starving. And Pine Ridge had been almost entirely leased. The allotments had been almost entirely leased in order to get some money in to keep the families alive by 1918. I wanted to just share with you a little Charles writing, just so you would get a flavor. And this comes from a 1911 book that he wrote called The Soul of the Indian. He said that when you live in close quarters, as you do when you're living in a teepee or a wigwam or whatever form of structure you're living in, you have to respect the property of others. But at the same time, material possessions are not very valued. You don't need material possessions. You don't have much space. And this is these are quotes from his book. The love of possessions is a weakness to be overcome. Self-discipline and self-denial are essential. Food is good, while surfeit kills. In other words, too much of it kills. Love is good, but lust destroys. Native Americans valued severe and persistent exercise and strict temperance in eating and in the sexual relation. Responsibility for community was central. The Native American is never permitted to forget that he does not live to himself alone, but to his tribe and his clan. We believed that the spirit pervades all creation and that every creature possesses a soul in some degree or other, even if it's not consciously thinking of it as a soul, if they're not thinking of it as a soul. He said, they, Native Americans, saw miracles on every hand, the miracle of life in seeds and egg, the miracle of death in flashing light, in lightning flash and the swell of the deep. The virgin birth would appear to him scarcely more miraculous than is the birth of every child that comes into the world. Or the miracle of the loaves and fishes excite more wonder than the harvest that springs from a single ear of corn. Indians saw miracles on every hand. I think this is actually a repeat, so let's go to the next. That same year that he wrote The Soul of the Indian, and his books, by the way, have never gone out of print. They're still available. If you look online, do a little search, it's easy to find them. That same year, he, with some other educated professionals in the Native community, formed an organization called the Society of American Indians. They formed this a year after the NAACP had its first meeting. The NAACP was an organization of Blacks and whites to work for better treatment, humane treatment, and an end to lynching, an end to the depredations that were being brought against Black people. But the Society of American Indians, that "of" is important because it's of American Indians, it's not whites and Indians. Although whites could participate in their annual meetings, they could not be declared, they could not be full voting members of the society. This society would be controlled by Native people. But it had a similar purpose to what the NAACP had. And it was formed, as I said, like a year later. They challenged the existence of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, suggested maybe it should be broken up, ended. They tried to be an advocacy organization and a link between indigenous nations. By this time, Charles is thinking pan-Indian. He's thinking from his own experience that all of the different nations are different nations, but they have some things in common. And so he's thinking in that pan-Indian way. The Society of American Indians published a quarterly journal of the Society of American Indians in which they highlighted the achievements of Native people and what was happening in different parts of the United States, and laws that were being laws or practices that were being enforced. That same year, Charles was one of 10 Americans invited to give a keynote address in London at the first Universal Races Conference. One other of the Americans invited was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the well-known Black scholar, an activist, person who had been one of the founders of the NAACP and its only paid staff, a person who had been a professor, who wrote quite a few, 10 volumes of books about Reconstruction or about Black history, who wrote the book, The Soul of Black Folks. Du Bois was quite well known, probably better known than Charles Eastman, but Charles Eastman was already pretty well known. He was invited by this time to be one of the celebrities to attend a dinner at Delmonico's in New York to celebrate the 70th birthday of Mark Twain, for example. Okay, at this first Universal Races conference, my imagination says this must have been a tremendously exciting moment for him, because all of these scholars were coming together who had experience in the colonies all around the world and in London itself, and in Britain itself, and in other countries in Europe. And they were looking at the issue of race, and they were looking at the assumptions that were being made in the popular culture, that there was a superior race, the European race, and inferior races could be ranked, which they could be identified. This one's a little better than that one. This one's a little bit worse than that one, etc. So at this conference, he writes after the conference, it was declared without reservation, without qualification by the Universal Races Congress at London in 1911, that there is no inherently superior race, therefore no inferior race. And in some instances, members of so-called uncivilized races have stood higher than the average civilized student. Therefore, they have the same inherent ability. Change the environment and the race is transformed, he wrote in his book, The Indian Today. I think that's a really, really powerful, just to imagine in growing up in a time of very acute racism, to hear scholars saying this must have been really mind-blowing and very affirming for him of what he had been working for and believing in and writing about for years. Still, he's troubled with the need for money. Elaine's always writing about how they have a shortage of money. So he takes different jobs. He collects artifacts for a university. He does some data collection for another university where a professor is trying to prove that Sacagawea died out west at a ripe old age. And so he does research on that as well and writes up a paper. He advises Edward Seton, who is founding the Boy Scouts and in Britain and in America, and thinking that the Boy Scouts will be a way to take street children and transform them into manly men. And also the Campfire Girls. I had a picture, but I couldn't find it when I went to put this together, of the Campfire Girls in Indian attire, because they and the Boy Scouts, of course, had Indian badges. This is a picture late in Charles' life. He's in his mid-70s when he attends a national gathering of the Boy Scouts. And he's sitting there in his regalia in the middle of the group. I love this picture. I think it's really a fun picture. He and Elaine found a camp in New Hampshire that will train white kids in the indigenous skills of athletics, like archery, for example, running, and will train them in manhood skills, the boys in manhood skills. This is a time when that's highly emphasized. He also is given the job of arranging President Coolidge's induction into the Lakota Nation when he visits Minnesota in 1927. President Coolidge was the president who actually extended, under his watch, citizenship for Native peoples became a fact in 1924. So they wanted to honor him, and Charles was in charge of that. Here's a picture from the camp of Dr. Eastman teaching girls, in this case, archery. Sorry that it's a little blurred. And here's a picture of President Coolidge and his wife meeting with indigenous leaders in Minnesota and receiving a headdress and induction as an honorary member of the nation. It's a pretty cool picture. Coolidge said it was the best thing, the most exciting thing that happened to him on his trip to the United States. And Coolidge, of course, well, not of course, but Coolidge knew the Eastmans. So that was a little bit of added, made it an even nicer time because he knew Elaine and Charles. In the 1920s, Charles became an inspector for the Indian Bureau, traveling again to different reservations, studying what was happening on the reservations and writing up reports for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 1912, 8 years earlier, he had hoped that he would become the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There were people promoting him. It looked like maybe it might happen. He couldn't stand Teddy Roosevelt, but he was still a Republican. And I wonder who he voted for in 1912, whether he voted for Taft or Roosevelt as a Republican. But the person who won when the Republican Party divided in 1912 was the Southern Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, who would not appoint an indigenous person to anything and would not appoint a Republican to be the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Remember, this is a time when it's not just Boy Scouts and Campfire Girls who are playing Indian. It's very popular in the culture. It's a kind of an irony that on the one hand, where there's a lot of negative happening in the official policy, there's also this kind of romanticizing of Native peoples and Native cultures. I'm sure Charles played a role in that with his books and his speeches. He was a very popular speaker as well. And sometimes he would speak wearing indigenous dress, and sometimes he would wear a suit. And usually he would actually do both. He'd come out for part of the presentation in a suit and tie, and then he'd also come out in his regalia. Eastman was at this point trying to institutionalize Indians in US history. Like the NAACP leaders, he thought one way to do that was to have an Indian week or an Indian month when people focused on Indian history. But he thought another way to do it was to have pageants about the past in America, the role that Native people played in America, in the United States. He wrote one that was used at a convention of the Society of American Indians. And he formally asked the government of the city of Minneapolis if they would perform it annually. They were going to perform it at the convention, but he said, this is something you could perform every year, and it would do so much good to breaking down the distrust between European American and Native American populations in our state, in the state of Minnesota. He went to Britain and traveled across the United States, giving speeches all the way through his 70s. He wrote a book on Native American history, and he was working on another book of Native American history when he died in 1939, almost 81 years old, a month short of being 81. But that's getting ahead of the story a little bit. When he's in his early 60s, his second daughter, Irene Saluda, and as you can see in this picture, she is doing the same thing her father's doing. Sometimes she performs in Native dress, and sometimes she performs in formal gowns of Western dress. Irene Saluda has an incredible voice, and her repertoire is both Native songs and traditional European music. And she had been offered a contract with the New York Metropolitan Opera in 1918, excuse me, in the fall of 1918. Her father said, you need to come to the camp in New Hampshire because this terrible pandemic has hit the United States and Europe, and people are dying, and it's affecting younger people especially, and I'm worried about you being in New York. I couldn't tell you not to go when you had this chance to go and make your debut or make your audition at the Metropolitan Opera, but it's, things are really bad now. You need to come to New Hampshire. So she came to New Hampshire. Her mother and some siblings were visiting her brother, who had signed up for the US military in World War I and was working in Washington, D.C. She came home. She and her father were at the camp in New Hampshire, and suddenly she got sick. And her father, being a medical doctor, knew immediately he had to get her to a hospital. He drove her to a hospital. They got her in to be looked at, and within less than a week, she was dead. This beautiful young woman. And not only was she an amazing singer and a bridge builder, but she was somebody who both of her parents felt especially attached to. She had this way about her. She was charismatic. She valued both cultures. And by this time, her parents are traveling different paths in their understanding of what is necessary in terms of Indian policy. So when she dies, it is a terrific blow. Her mother is of Puritan heritage. Her mother never has been able to deal with death. She always just closes up. She never expresses emotion when someone dear to her dies. And that's what she does at the death of Irene Saluda. Whereas Charles, in his culture, you would take a year where you would seriously grieve. You would give everything away, and you would, deeply grieve the loss of your loved one. So they're on different trajectories. And you can imagine when the child who is kind of the one that everybody is most proud of suddenly dies, it's devastating for them. So what about Elaine? Like Charles, she continued to write. Each of them wrote 11 books. She raised their 6 children, but she became bitter. And I read her letters at Smith, and it took me a long time to get to the point where I could appreciate her, because her letters, as in her later years, were so bitter and so complaining about her husband and his not being able to bring in enough money, and the hardships they were facing, and the work she had to do raising the kids while he was off visiting reservations, setting up programs, naming the Sioux, etc. She made the choice to stay with her husband. Her mother had left her husband when she didn't feel that she was being provided for properly. But Elaine made the choice to stay with Charles. This was a time in the 1920s when women were breaking out of gender roles. I mean, some women were breaking out of gender roles. She wrote novels. She wrote a novel about Wounded Knee, quite an interesting novel. And she wrote political analysis of Indian policy. She wrote for journals. And in her mid-70s, she published her last book, which was a biography of Richard Pratt, the founder of Carlisle and the Indian Industrial Boarding Schools. Charles and Elaine had been growing apart. They disagreed what Indian policy should be. She was moving more toward assimilation, toward saying, okay, they're never going to really be accepted. We have 6 children. I want to raise them to be white. I want to raise them to identify as white, because that's in their best interests. Charles, every year, would take them back to Flandreau and make sure that they were on the Dawes rolls and that they were with other people of his community. But Elaine was moving in the opposite direction. She asked Charles to leave when she discovered that evidence that he had had an affair and that he had a child the year after Irene Saluda's death. And that was devastating to her. And she wrote a novel in which she featured a couple in which to whom this had happened. The wife in that novel keeps telling her husband, bring the child into our house and we will raise it. And she's insistent about it. And he's saying, I can't do that. I can't take her away from her mother and bring her into our house. So it's beginning to creep into her writing. some of what's going on in her personal feelings and her personal life. She asked him to leave after their daughter, after a wedding of one of their daughters. And he moves out and he buys a cabin on Des Barats Island in Lake Michigan. And he goes there for half of each year, and he spends the other half of the year in Detroit with their only son, 5 daughters and 1 son. And he never sees her again. She never sees him again. But as one of Charles' relatives, one of his descendants said to me, people focus on the end of their relationship. And I think that's the wrong place to focus, he said. I think what's important is the work that they did together, the advocacy that they did over all those decades until things went sour. And there is lots of evidence in her earlier letters and in her writings that they both deeply respected and loved each other for a long time until it came to the point. And I think Irene Saluda's death was a big part of it, that they just no longer could see their way clear. Elaine had moved a long way by the time she was in her 80s from where she began when she was teaching Indian children in her 20s, as we see in these photographs that she took. And that's what I have to give you tonight. I'd like to thank you for being here and ask for your questions and your comments.
Yes, thank you, Gretchen. It's extraordinary, 2 extraordinary people and an extraordinary story, and yeah. So those of you questions, would love to hear them. Again, there's the Q&A button for those of you in Zoom. You can use questions that way or type them in the chat. And those of you on Facebook can also type in the chat. Let me see here.
And also, if there are, if people would like to see one of these pictures, I'm going to stop screen sharing if nobody wants me to go back to a picture. But if you want me to go back to a slide or a picture, I'll be happy to do that. Or I can do it after.
Yeah, and I turned off the screen share, but yeah, we can cut it back on if somebody wants to see a picture again. I was just, it's interesting. Did Charles ever, because he spent so much time working for the U.S. government in one capacity or another, and then he was also involved in this society that was founding the society that was very critical of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and all of that. So I guess just did that enter into his writings where he would talk about any ambivalence that he felt?
That's a really good question. I don't recall him talking directly about his ambivalence. What we know from letters, correspondence, and Elaine had a nephew, for example, who would stay with them at Lodestone in Amherst, and would write then he wrote letters to his parents, and he was kind of like the inside spy on the family, because he would say, "Oh, Aunt Elaine is just she's just so ornery, and she comes down on the doctor. They always called him the doctor. She comes down on the doctor and criticizes him, and he takes his son Ohiyesa and we go sleep in a teepee in the backyard. And he does complain about Teddy Roosevelt. He says Teddy Roosevelt's a terrible man, and we also know that Charles, when he was let's see, where was I going with this? When he thought he was going to be nominated to be the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, someone had put forward his name, and he really thought that might be a good thing, even though he had called for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to be dissolved. He called for it in writing. If you look at the issues of the magazine of the Society of Indian Affairs, they didn't mince words. They were very clear about the evils of the treatment of Native peoples by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But of course, it depended on who was commissioner. They had been close to Thomas Jefferson, one of the first commissioner, the commissioner that was their friend when they first were at Wounded Knee. And he was a really good man, Thomas Jefferson Morgan. And so Charles knew that depended on who was commissioner, what that organization would do. And he believed that if he was nominated as commissioner, he could really make changes. But there was not one voice within the Native community, just as there isn't today, and just as there isn't in any community. So there were other people who were thought Charles was far too radical in his views of about the Indian Bureau. So I hope that answers a little bit of your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess it just occurred to me, I don't know if there was a Native American head of that bureau later on, but I know that Deb Haaland was, who's the current Secretary of the Interior, is the first Native American in that role, which is now includes.
Yeah, yes, there were Native Americans. There was a Seneca, a part of the Iroquois Nation, who was the Secretary of the Interior earlier, before Charles period, and there would be somebody. I think there's somebody later as well, but they're mostly not. I mean, and people like Walter Jones, who is the one that was one of the ones that was so corrupt. He was in there for a long time, many terms, and taking money. The 20s was a time of great corruption in American politics, and a lot of that corruption was directly involving the large amounts of money that were going to Native nations. And that's been pretty well documented. I think history runs in cycles, and I think I think it's 100-year cycles as well as shorter time periods. So I think it's very I find it really interesting to read about what was going on, the cronyism and the giving of contracts, and the secretaries of the Interior who were there were, like, for example, in 1920. Under the Harding administration, there were 3 cabinet officials who were found guilty of corruption. So it was a rough time for democracy.
Yeah, and Suzanne, who I think might be some relation to you,
my sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law. Okay, great. She wrote, could you talk about appropriation of Native American culture by Scouts and Girl Guides? Seems like it was more accepted at that time than it is now.
Yes. And that, Charles Eastman, one of the reasons I started writing about and researching Charles Eastman was scholars have really different perspectives on him. There were some scholars who said, okay, he did the naming of the Sioux. Well, that was playing into assimilation. That was giving people names so that they could be ripped off and they accept 160 acres and lose all that communal land. He's nothing but an assimilationist. Some other people have criticized him and said, oh, Elaine must have written all his books. He probably didn't write anything. Well, I think I've demonstrated in my book from the research I've done with various repositories that he did his own writing, and he wrote after they separated. There are lots of things in the archives, lots of things that he wrote in the archives. Okay, but Suzanne is saying appropriation of Native American ways. I think things were so bad in the period from 1890 through up to like 1940 that leaders within the Native American community who had been privileged to get an education, a solid education at actual universities, not just at boarding schools, people like Charles were able to say, anything we can do to humanize our people to the majority culture. If they can see us as people, if they can see us as people who have a spiritual life, who have traditions of being very athletic, the athleticism was a huge part of Native culture, and it is a huge part of American culture today, but it wasn't so much. During that earlier time period, he's saying, if I can write my stories about my childhood in ways that a little white kid can read the stories in my Indian boyhood and can say, wow, that's so cool. I wish I could do that. I wish I could go out and hunt squirrels with a slingshot, or think about even think about going to Canada, and he's riding on in the bladder of an animal that's been blown up to make a kind of raft, so he can be transported along the river as they're walking from Minnesota, southern Minnesota, all the way to the Canadian border. Huge, huge thing. So I think, as far as he's concerned, it wasn't expropriate. It was expropriation. Okay, it was expropriation for the purpose of really building empathy and hopefully support for Native people's citizenship, because citizenship didn't come right until 1924, even though allotment came in 1887, began in 1887. There's one other thing that he was criticized for, and other Native writers of the time, like Standing Bear, Luther Standing Bear, and Zit Kalisha, they were criticized because they used the term savage in their writing, and they were writing for a white audience. So they're walking this precarious tightrope between being able to be read, to get the white audience to want to read them. I think we're seeing some of this in the book banning that's going on right now, that there's been a real surge of reading of books by people of color, but there's also a lot of anxiety about those stories getting out, and that your kids might be reading those stories, might be reading what happened to people. I think there's some parallels there, but anyway, let me leave it at that. But he was writing, trying primarily to get his white audience to alter their view. Good question, Suzanne.
Yeah. And I guess, I know that the Indian ways thing, it's like, is still a big part of Boy Scouting, at least I know. And then I know that my father went to summer camps where that was the main theme every summer was you have your tribe, and you get your Indian name, and there's all these activities that are based on the idea that it's like what Native Americans would do. So it is interesting to know that there were at least Native American that actually was involved in some of the early manifestations of that cultural trend or force.
Yeah. He was very definitely the reason there were Indian badges. Mm-hmm. Seton contacted him and said, "I'm just so excited by reading your books and your articles, and I'd like to work together."
Yeah. And I'm looking in the chat. There's several comments from people saying that it's such a great presentation, and you so deserve your awards that you've won. So well done on that.
Thank you.
And then let's see. Howard said, Howard in the comments said, beautifully presented and so clear. He taught a year at Haskell, and then some more information there that you can see. But then he wrote, I taught Menominees at Bowler, Wisconsin, and Oneidas at Oneida, Wisconsin. In grade school, I read a book entitled Moccasin Trails. Would that have been a book that Charles Eastman wrote?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that title.
Okay. So there you go. And then on the Facebook comments, Ernestine asked, can you hear me?
Yeah.
On the Facebook comments, Ernestine asked, why were the Eastmans having anything? I guess this kind of goes with the walking the tightrope and the things we've been talking about. Why would the Eastmans have anything to do with the Carlisle School as it stripped away Indian language and culture? Because
they had a desperate need for employment. They had 6 kids. He was lobbying Congress and getting nowhere. He was criticized because actually they left the Secretary of the Interior at that time, who was his nemesis, who had been appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, whose name was Loop, L-E-U-P-P, criticized Charles because he said he left Washington, D.C. without paying his final rent bill. That's an illustration of how desperate they were. Charles did not want to go to Carlisle. Elaine had talked back to Pratt when she'd been working on the Great Plains, and Pratt had come out to try to negotiate taking more land, more Lakota land. And she had talked back to him. She'd been admitted into the councils where everybody else was native. And so she had a history of really confronting Pratt, but now she turns around and says, "We need work. Will you hire us, please?" And she had actually a good time while Charles did not, because once again, she was able to have an actual job. She was editing and writing the different publications, the Red Men and the different publications of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So for her, that was a good time. She got to go give speeches. She had students who could take care of her kids. For her, that was good. For Charles, it was awful. Yeah. He had to go recruit kids for the school that he didn't believe in.
Yeah. And it's, I guess it sounds to me like, from, am I gathering right, that he never was allowed to treat white people as a doctor, or maybe during medical school, or?
No, he was allowed to, but they wouldn't, when he set up his practice in Minnesota, people didn't come to him. I mean, you think about it today, when you think about what doctor you go to, sometimes people are more comfortable going to a doctor who looks like them. And so if you're, I think it still goes on. I think some of that still goes on today. Hopefully it's much better than it was. But he just didn't have people who would come to him.
Yeah. And I'm sure that, obviously there was racism at play there, that when they were in such financial straits that he couldn't rely on his skills as a doctor to make a better living there. That's certainly unjust. Well, great. Let me see here. Suzanne wrote, let me see. Oh, wait, you did have one more question just came in from Michael Pogue. He wrote, "Gretchen, great work. In your opinion, why do we as a society look for any Indian blood in our ancestry and are so proud to find even a rumor of that familial connection, when at the same time we shun and deny any African-American blood in our ancestry?"
Really good question. Really good question. There is a wonderful book by Philip Deloria from Yale, who is called Playing Indian. And he has another one called Indians in Unexpected Places, where he looks at these popular culture phenomena of our sort of idealizing Indians. This is a period, as I said before, of a lot of repression for both the Black and the Native communities. It's parallel. They're running on parallel tracks, and it's a very resurgent racism that's going on. But at the same time, there's a lot of interracial marriage, among kind of elite people. There will be people like, there are a number of them, but I can't think of her name. Anyway, who people with a lot of money who partner and marry someone who is Native, and it has an exoticism about it. It's just like finding your Indian blood, feels exotic even still. I think we still carry that from that period of the early 20th century when it was first becoming very exotic. There were Indian movies made. There were lots of, when films first started to be made, there were a number of Native actors and directors, and there were a number of films produced even by the big studios at first, and then that stopped. So why do we treat one group differently to have that blood? Maybe that's changing. Maybe I think to some extent it is changing, that we're feeling some pride today if we have ancestry that is mixed, whichever. Monica Warnken just put up, isn't it also possible that if there's any Indian blood, there's likely to be African-American blood? I think that's also true, that there was a lot of mixing between Native peoples and African-Americans, especially in the Southeast. And in Oklahoma. Yeah, so there's the freedmen, the people who travel on the various trails of tears, the freedmen, the freed African Americans or who had fled slavery, came on the trails of tears and settled and consider themselves Cherokee. Many of their descendants today consider themselves Cherokee, and that's been a highly contested area because when the minorities tend to also, in any culture, the minorities will also walk a different kind of a tightrope between appealing to the majority culture. They need allies in the majority culture to protect themselves. And so appealing to the majority culture is a common phenomenon. And so the Cherokee, for example, have had periods even very recently of rejecting their Black Cherokee brothers and sisters and denying them full membership in the nation. And that, on one level, it's understandable because you're walking this tightrope, trying to court allies among the majority community, and yet also trying to make allegiances and understand that you're in the same boat as these other groups.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you to everybody for coming tonight. I know we got to close up, but thank you so much for coming. I'm just delighted that you've shown interest in this subject. The book, They Met at Wounded Knee, is in the library, in the public library in Wichita, as well as I have it. It's at Watermark, etc. And I hope you might check it out.
Yeah, and it's here in Newton as well. Thank you, Gretchen. And I should say, we've already planned, Gretchen has graciously agreed to return. I believe is it in February or March?
I think it's February.
Yeah, and I've got it written down somewhere, but stay tuned for that, because in February, we're going to have Gretchen back on our history / genealogy third Tuesday series to talk about Descent in Wichita, her earlier nonfiction book. So I'm really looking forward to that. This was such a great presentation and discussion. So yes, thank you again, and yeah, stay tuned for February, I guess.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.